OK. Let me just bring in old David Aronovich here, who's uncharacteristically quiet. What do you think, in these circumstances, should be our attitude towards religious leaders like the Pope and religious institutions?
Well, I mean, as a practicing atheist, I look at religion essentially as a kind of, if you like, an anthropological matter. Yeah. Why do people want it, and what function does it fulfil? And one of the things I notice, I mean, we talk a lot about the negative aspects of churches and so on, but there are other things also which happen around churches. I mean, for instance, why is it that the Methodists are the people who organise to support asylum seekers? Why is it the Church of England that has been most active on the question of poverty and debt relief for
And the Catholic
Africa?
Church does fantastic stuff, as does the Salvation Army, with homeless people.
And I think that's entirely true. And I think if you look at some of the functions that religious organisations give, organising people who have an ethical belief, now they're not the only people who do, but they do, then some of that can be pretty valuable.
I'm sure it is valuable.
Now, John Haldane, the interesting thing is why the Catholic Church in this context, or the context of the papal visit, has got the astonishing influence that it does have, with governments willing to roll over on pieces of legislation to please the bishops.
Well, I suppose the experience is that perhaps they haven't rolled over as much as...
Well, they rolled over on questions like faith schools, for example.
But if we ask, to take your question, why the Catholic Church, why is it featuring in this way, I think the answer to that is probably that for many people, the Catholic Church is now seen to be the embodiment of traditional Christian belief and practice. So, I mean, if you look at the attention that's been given to this papal visit, it's inconceivable that any other religious leader could possibly attract as much attention, whether it be positive or negative criticism or just news coverage. So I think probably it's the point, we've reached the point in this country at any rate, where people tend to think, if they think of religion, certainly if they think of Western Christian religion, then they tend to think of Roman Catholicism, with all that's good and bad attached to that.
You can't see her, Professor Haldane, but down here Mary Warnock is shaking her head. Go on.
Well, let Mary speak for herself.
Go on.
Well, I think that this picture of the Catholic Church is quite wrong, I mean, in this country. I think if there is... well, there is a function for the Church in all kinds of ways, but it's the Church of England that is the established Church that has all...
You were just banging on about how the bishop shouldn't be in the House of Lords.
Yeah, well, yes, but I know. It's the connection of the bishops as exclusively in charge of morals that I object to. Other people, justice, their morality is just as well founded if it's founded on...
Well, I don't know whether your experience is the same, Jeremy, but when I first joined a newspaper, The Independent, I was told the one thing they didn't want me to do was upset the Catholics. They said, you know, you can try not to offend the Catholics unnecessarily. I don't think people believe that now anymore about the Catholic Church, but they certainly do tend to believe it about Islam. And you might very well get the same kind of instruction, not out of fear or anything like that, but because it feels as if there is an organised body of people who are easily offended with the Catholic Church at the moment, because of what's happened in the last 20 years, and also because this Pope simply doesn't have the celebrity function that the previous Pope had. It's become incredibly easy to knock the Catholic Church.
But this raises a very interesting question. It's quite clear within Western Catholicism that many so-called Catholics are not following the dictates of the Church on questions like contraception, for example. Quite clearly, they are just ignoring the writ of the Church. Now, when a church can't even exert its authority over its own members, why should the rest of us pay any attention to it, John Haldane?
Well, I'm not necessarily asking you to pay attention to it, but can I just pick up what David Aronovich was saying? I mean, I think part of the reason why there was that sense that one had to be careful where one trod is connected to similar feelings today about Islam. It's partly to do with the historical circumstances, the socio-economic history, the immigrant groups and so on, that this was, as were, a political dimension to this. Similarly, I'm struck by Mary Warnock's reaction, having begun by, as it were, attacking the idea of an established church, very rapidly coming to its defence when the thought is presented that perhaps people tend to think of Catholicism as being the focus. As regards the matter of Catholics' own belief and practice, I think one thing that has happened, which is interesting, is that people are inclined, not just in the sphere of religion, but more generally, to think that it's up to them to define what they are. And so the idea that they might be answerable to their beliefs to some sort of external authority, I think that is something that has waned. And we see it in this sphere as we see it in other spheres as well, political ones also.
Does that make the Pope less relevant?
Not towards content of Catholicism.
Well,
And
the
you see,
answer to that would have to be yes, wouldn't it?
Yes.
I mean, based on what you yourself have said, it would have eventually to be yes. And isn't that really the difficulty? The previous Pope appeared to have relevance through the kind of personality he was. The problem is that this Pope does actually embody the very things that people think are irrelevant to them. In other words, attitude towards women and other people and other factors.
He's also
people don't
interventionist,
accept.
this Pope. I mean, he instructed people how they were Catholics, how they were to vote before the next the last election.
The point where you rationalists, secularists and atheists are in some difficulty, are you not, is the fact that the Pope claims to be in touch with another dimension, with a God. Now, you guys don't, you can only rely on your own resources.
Well, no, absolutely. If there were a God, then he wouldn't have let Werder Bremen come back from 2-0 against Tottenham Hotspur this evening, is my kind of feeling about it. But I can't expect intercession on that point. Anyway, it's too late.
I think David Aronovich's view is probably that of Gibbon, I think, important if true. Yeah.
Mary Warnock.
I think people do make a terrible mistake when they say, do you believe that God exists or do you not believe that God exists? This is a very complicated question, but they ask it as if God were an object like a television set or tables or chairs. And nobody thinks, if they say that they do believe in God, nobody thinks that God is an object about which you can say it's this shape or that shape or has this characteristic or that. And I think it terribly confuses this question when people raise that sort of simplistic question.
But now Mary Warnock is speaking as a theologian, as it were. I mean, telling us that our thoughts about
God
God are...
of many parts, you know.
Absolutely, yes. Can I just go back to one thing? When David Aronovich came in and said, well, you know, the Pope is no longer relevant, what I was going to say is the word relevant invites the question, relevant to what? What I think the Pope, and I take the point that for many Catholics who simply, or people who self-identify as Catholics, just who live, as it were, independently of what the Pope and the Church might teach, in that sense lost its relevance. But if we're looking at a different question, where does the Catholic Church go next? How is it likely to develop and so on? Then I think we probably will see a smaller church, but one more loyal to the traditional teachings, which are represented by the Pope and by such things as the Catechism of the Catholic Church and so on. So I think in that sense relevant.
Right. Well, you two certainly can't talk about the Catechism, so I think we'll just stop it there for the time being. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
OK.